Chapter 1. Kendo and the Yokaran, Leader of the Pack. I was born on December 11th, 1926, and raised in a little country village called Kitano Kotesashi in Saitama Prefecture, not too far from Tokyo. I am the second son with 3 brothers and 2 sisters. We lived in a big house separated from our neighbours by 8 zelkova trees and sheltered by oaks to the south. My family name, Odachi, literally means big house. My ancestors can be traced back to the Nita-Genji clan, a prominent aristocratic warrior family of 1,000 years ago. At the end of the 12th century, a Genji general by the name of Minamoto Yoritomo established Japan's first military government, the Kamakura shogunate. In the 14th century, vassals of the Kamakura shogunate enacted a coup d'état to topple the military government, and my Odachi ancestors joined them. A new Muromachi shogunate was subsequently established in Kyoto, but the political situation was far from stable. A split soon formed in the imperial court, and for many decades in the 14th century, a northern and a southern court coexisted. The Odachi clan supported the southern court, and were thus shunned by the Muromachi shogunate, which established the northern court. Eventually, the northern court became recognized as the sole imperial authority, and supporters of the defunct southern court were forced to scatter and hide throughout Japan. My ancestors returned to the Kanto Plain, and that's where we remained. I entered Kotesashi Elementary School in April 1933. It was the only school in the village. It had one first-grade class of around 70 students. We were quintessential hale and hearty country kids. The younger ones were looked after by the seniors, and we all played together in the fields and at the village shrine every day. Before I took up the traditional martial art of kendo, I filled my days playing war games or hunting sparrows with the others. The so-called bosses of children gangs were usually 5th or 6th graders. This lofty mantle of authority was bestowed upon me in the 6th grade. After school, I would direct my tribe of urchins to gather at a designated time and place, such as at the shrine gate. I would rush home, gobble down a snack, and then head to the rendezvous point. Homework was never a priority. I called the shots, and all the boys in my posse followed my lead. Each tribe had its own patch of turf, and gang scuffles were not an uncommon occurrence. I remember Japan gearing up for war in my childhood days. Physical training started to take precedence over academic classes in schools. I excelled in physical education classes and enjoyed competing. I also joined the village's newly formed bugle group. Our main task was to regale young men of the village with patriotic compositions at the local train station as they departed for the front. As the world descended into chaos, we kids were more concerned with our own battles. We fought constantly with children from the neighbouring village of Yamaguchi. Mr. Kuroda's house was located between our 2 villages. Respected by all who met him, he exuded an air of stateliness like a samurai of old. He wore a black jacket with a high collar and loudly recited old poems as he walked to and from school with his characteristic ramrod-straight posture. Mr. Kuroda was transferred to our school in 1937 when I was a 5th grader. He was 23 years old at the time and had just graduated from Saitama Prefectural Normal School, where he trained as a teacher. He was reputed to be a kendo practitioner of considerable skill. He told us that the style of kendo he practiced was related to the Hokushin Ito Ryu, one of the predominant styles of classical swordsmanship during the Edo period, 1603 to 1868. It was under his strict tutelage that I started kendo. Kuroda-sensei taught kendo during physical education classes, for which we were required to buy a wooden practice sword. Training was harsh. Although prohibited in kendo today, foot sweeping and wrestling the opponent to the ground was standard. Kendo is usually practiced in bare feet on polished wooden floors. Our school did not have a martial arts dojo, so at first he took us through sword forms outside. Alas, in the name of tradition, he wouldn't allow us to wear shoes. This resulted in severe grazing of knees and elbows. Torn shirts and bloodied bodies were par for the course. The wounds would become infected because of the grit and sand, and red pee because of the severity of the exercise was not unusual. My mother was not keen on me continuing, but quitting was not an option. I thrived on the thrill and excitement of it all. In all honesty, I didn't enjoy being dragged across the ground, but resisting all attempts by Mr. Kuroda to grind me into the dirt made me stronger in body and mind. Before long, he was unable to get the better of me. Eventually, we were allocated a classroom to train in, which required moving the desks and chairs out of the way before each session. It sure beat jumping around barefooted on the gravel in the schoolyard. It wasn't until we got the protective equipment that kendo became interesting. The local government gifted 50 sets of kendo armor to the village. This allowed us to engage in full-contact sparring using bamboo practice swords. There were 7 or 8 members in our kendo club. I outshone all of them. During the day, we would practice in PE class and had extracurricular sessions 2 nights a week. Other boys from the area also started kendo, and Mr. Shimizu from the nearby Army Academy came to help with the teaching. Adults in the village with some experience came to assist Kuroda-sensei as he took us through our paces. Every time we tried to land a strike with our bamboo swords on Mr. Kuroda-sensei's head, he would kick our feet out from under us. It was tough going. A kendo tournament was held annually at the local shrine. I entered the competition and remember standing proudly on the winner's podium to receive a prize of bamboo swords for my efforts. I then participated in the prefectural championships when I was in the 6th grade. It was held in a special kendo hall at a big Shinto shrine in Omiya. Kendo was popular throughout the mountainside regions of Saitama Prefecture, but not so much in the plains area where we were. It was always the mountain boys who prevailed in the major tournaments. They were hard to beat. The tournament was officially started with a demonstration of sword forms by the legendary kendo masters Sasaburo Takano and Hakudo Hiromichi Nakayama. Mr. Kuroda told us observe them carefully. I was not particularly interested in the exhibition of prescribed forms and failed to appreciate the great men I was watching. I was more captivated by an old army general with his magnificent moustache in the VIP seats. As for the matches, my team was knocked out of the competition early on. The individual competition was a different matter. I won my early bouts and made it to the semi-finals. It could have been the first time a plains lad defeated the almighty mountain boys to become the junior champion, but sadly I had to settle for 3rd place. The bells of war were ringing louder than ever by the time I graduated from elementary school. Junior high school boys wore black uniforms with high collars like priests and puttees on their legs like soldiers. Schools were transformed into training grounds to prepare youth for battle, and bayonet training was added to kendo practice. With a military base located near our village, the militaristic mood was perhaps more pronounced than in other regions. We took great delight in watching the giant mechanical birds landing and taking off at the Tokorozawa Air Base. There were no roads leading to the base, so we walked for an hour navigating blindly through fields and pastures to get there. The airbase was enclosed by barbed wire, but we knew of a small opening in the fence through which we could sneak inside. We lay on our stomachs in the long grass alongside the runway, observing the planes circling above. The pilots must surely have seen us. On occasion, soldiers would come by in cars to watch as well. We hid motionless in the undergrowth and waited for them to move along. All I wanted to do from then was become a pilot. I was 14 on that fateful day of December 8, 1941, when Pearl Harbor was attacked. I heard the news on the radio. Japan has declared war on America and Britain. Large families were common in those days. If there were 3 sons, the eldest was expected to remain and take care of family affairs, but the 2nd and 3rd sons were destined for the front. Knowing this, I was determined to enter the Yokaren, Naval Aviator Preparatory Course, the elite preliminary training program for Navy pilots. I wanted to fight for Japan in the sky. I told Mother of my intention to sit the Yokaren examination. She objected at first, but I persisted and told her that if at least one of her 4 sons were not prepared to serve, our family would lose face in the village. Mother cried as she realized that there was little choice in the matter. My father said nothing. As it happens, one of my other brothers joined the army. He also survived the war. The Yokaran examination was tough and consisted of Japanese, mathematics, and science. These were all subjects I studied at school, but the examination was of a much higher level. In addition, we were expected to memorize the Imperial Rescript to Japanese soldiers and sailors as an introduction to the martial spirit of Japan. I studied it every day and even bought supplemental textbooks to prepare for the exam held in Mie Prefecture's naval base. Thousands of candidates gathered from around the country, including many from Saitama. I was 16 at the time. I travelled to Mie, just below Nagoya, by train with two friends from a neighbouring village, Kinzo Kasuya and Hiroshi Toyoda. See photos. Hiroshi was the dux of his school, and Kinzo was also a smart kid. Other boys in our villages failed, but we three passed. Father, hearing of my success, said nothing. To him it was a matter of course. Mother said with a tinge of sadness, "Good for you." Chapter 2. Training Hell. The Kasumigara Naval Aviator Preparatory Course, Yokaran, in Chiba Prefecture, was full. A new special B-class course was established at the Iwakuni Naval Air Base in Yamaguchi Prefecture in spring of 1943. It was designed as a shorter, more intensive training program, and I was inducted into the first cohort of cadets. It was an enthusiastic send-off by the villagers, not the usual adieu given to draftees, as I was the first ever Yokaran trainee from our village. This was considered quite an honour and seemed to warrant much pomp and ceremony. Relatives and well-wishers gathered at my home for a big party the night before departure. At 8 o'clock the following morning, I marched to the Kitano Tenmangu Shrine, where the district's traditional protective deity is enshrined. Hundreds of people turned up to wish me luck and walk with me to the shrine. Village youngsters at the head of the parade brandished a big flag emblazoned with the words, "Congratulations, Kazuo Odachi, Yokaran trainee." Others performed military songs with their trumpets and drums. I followed the band, and the mayor, assemblymen, and teachers walked behind me. Nearly 200 elementary school pupils also joined in the parade. We ascended the stone steps of the shrine, where I was blessed by a Shinto priest in front of the main worship hall. Returning along the same route to the station, we passed hundreds of children in front of the school waving small Japanese flags and enthusiastically shouting, "Way to go, Kazu-san! Good luck!" I was about to respond in kind, but remembered the distinguished gentleman behind me and thought it prudent to behave in a more adult manner. Even more villagers were waiting near the station. The mayor entered the station building with trumpeters lined up next to him. They blasted a fanfare, and all gathered, turned and bowed in the direction of the Imperial Palace. The mayor then delivered his address. "Allow me to offer a few words of encouragement to our brave young Mr. Odachi, who is about to embark on his adventure to fight for Japan." When he finished, I made a snappy salute and responded in kind. "I thank you all for this send-off. I will do my best to serve with honour and repay your kindness with dedication to duty. I shall now humbly take my leave." I boarded the train amid a flurry of red and white as everybody waved their flags. My parents did not attend my grand farewell. They were too busy making traditional celebratory food to give to neighbours for their support. The send-off was lavish in every way. I figured that they all secretly thought I'd be dead within a couple of years, and this was my last hurrah. Kinzo Kasuya and Hiroshi Toyoda boarded the same train at the next station. We all set off together as brothers of the so-called Cherry Blossom Corps. In their case, however, it was to be their final goodbye. They were killed in action a few years later. The Iwakuni Naval Air Base was built in 1938, and that was where we commenced our Yokaran training there. Rising at 6 o'clock each morning, the days started with physical exercise followed by breakfast. Then it was classes and training sessions until 17:30. Evenings were set aside for self-study and revision. We took classes in mathematics and other subjects just as we did at school, with the addition of Morse code and English. Flying didn't come until later. Our instructors in the early stages were originally school teachers, but their lessons were severe beyond compare. Our basic military training consisted of bayonet fighting and marching. We also practiced sumo wrestling, marksmanship, and various team-building exercises. Rowing was particularly exacting. The oars were thick and blistered our hands, and our backsides became bruised from the hard seats. Everything we did was connected to training. Even walking from one barrack to another was prohibited. We had to run. We were not allowed into the mess hall when morning classes finished until passing an impromptu test first. An officer would order us to halt. A soldier on the roof then signalled with flags, and we had to decipher the code. Whispering our answers into the officer's ear, we were given permission to enter the mess hall if we got it right. Otherwise, we would be stuck outside and subjected to a barrage of insults decrying our lack of military spirit. Insults were one thing, but being forced to forego lunch was the worst. Every minute of every day felt as if we were in our own small war, but I had no issue with even the strictest instruction. I was determined to never show the white feather of defeat, as it was a matter of pride. I kept my sights firmly on becoming a fighter pilot. Kinzo, Hiroshi, and I chose this way, so failure was not an option. There were about 1,800 fellow trainees in Iwakuni, and many of the cadets in our first Special B-class course were outstanding fellows. As more pilots were killed in action, we were sent to fill the gaps and became corps aviators in the air fleets stationed around Taiwan and the Philippines. Thrust into the centre of the action, our cohort was destined to suffer the largest number of casualties in the war. One memory I have from that time was the mysterious demise of the battleship Mutsu in June 1943. The Mutsu was one of the largest battleships in the world. Even though it was anchored in Hiroshima about 20 kilometers away from our base, the almighty noise from the explosion was clearly audible. The cause of the explosion remains unknown. After 6 months in Iwakuni, we relocated to the Nagoya base to undertake the midterm training course. The base was on top of a hill near the little town of Koromo. It was appallingly chilly there, and life was bleak. We were taught flying basics in gliders before advancing to the Red Dragonflies, the nickname for Yokosuka K-5Y biplane trainers. Their colour, however, was orange. 4 trainees made up one team, and we repeated takeoffs and landings under the watchful eye of instructors seated in the back. Typical flight training would go as follows. I would allocate the top of the hill in front as the target. After informing the instructor target OK through the comms tube, I pushed down on the lever to take off. Gradually ascending to 200 m, I would call first turn and made a 90-degree turn to the left. At the next turning point, I would make one more 90-degree turn to the left and fly the reverse route looking down on the runway. I would then make a third turn to the left and then one more before descending to land on 3 points. That is, a stable landing on the 2 wheels attached to the main wings and the rear wheel. After successfully touching down, I would disembark and run to report to the trainer. The next trainee would then head to the cockpit while I returned to the bench to observe his flight. In addition to this basic training, we also practiced more complex maneuvers such as the aileron roll, vertical loop, left diagonal loop, right diagonal loop, and hammerhead stall. The left oblique spin involved climbing to the upper left, turning over, and then descending. The hammerhead stall was executed by climbing quickly on an angle, and as the plane lost speed at the highest point, a sudden turn was executed. This technique was an evasion maneuver often used by Zero fighters. Our Red Dragonflies could perform it just as well, if not better than Zeros, because they flew slowly without the undue stress that resulted in catastrophic structural failure seen in other machines. Still, the Red Dragonfly was not immune to the occasional mechanical fiasco. I had 2 frightening experiences with the engine suddenly cutting out. I thought I was doomed and informed my instructor that I was preparing to crash land on the bamboo below. Fortunately, the engine came back to life and thankfully saved mine. Trainees also made mistakes. Every now and again, the wheel struts under the wings would collapse because of heavy landings. This would inevitably earn a hard slap in the face from the instructor, along with a stream of profanities for taking the piss. We had 3 uniforms, a flight suit, practice suit, and formal wear. Our formal uniform was a black, high-collared suit with 7 buttons. Engraved on each of the buttons was a small cherry blossom and an anchor. We became known as 7 Buttons because of the uniforms, and there was even a song about us. The young, hot-blooded men of the Yokaren, cherry blossoms and anchors, 7 buttons so smart. Our formal uniforms fitted well, but flight and practice suits and shoes were a different matter. Asking for something in our size would result in being told to go boil your head and make your body fit the clothes instead of whining for clothes that fit your body. The flight boots were awful. My shoe size was 24 centimetres, but I was issued with 28 centimetres boots, making it hard to control the foot pedal in the cockpit. Running around base without tripping up was also a mission. We wore our practice uniforms most of the time. Referred to as sailor suits, these were not made to fit either. There were fewer buttons than our iconic formal wear, and the hems of the trousers were overstated bell-bottoms, supposedly making them easier to remove them if we ended up in the sea. Even bedtime was a test of grit. We underwent a nightly ritual of setting up our hammocks as the trainers timed us. We placed our hammocks on the floor and knelt as we waited for the signal. With the sound of a whistle, we grabbed the metal hooks and attached them to the poles, unwound the hammock cords, placed the pillow inside and shouted, "Done!" If the last one in our team took more than 18 seconds, we would be scolded for our deplorable lack of enthusiasm and would have our backsides whacked 3 or 4 times with the trainer's disciplinary baton dubbed the martial spirit bludgeon. The time limit was gradually shortened to 17 seconds, then 16 seconds. Life was tough, and there wasn't much to enjoy about the experience. Even washing clothes was toilsome beyond belief. Navy boys were expected to look smart and well-groomed. This meant that we had to wash our clothes often, but the laundry facilities were on an exposed hill where the frigid wind and freezing water prevented the soap suds from dissolving. Our hands were paralyzed with cold, and it took forever to get our gear clean. The instructors habitually frightened the living daylights out of us. We found out later that some of them were hardened veterans, but many others were not. The latter were dropouts who lacked the necessary skills, or who were not imbued with the right stuff to be fighter pilots. As such, these fellows tended to be relentless in their bullying, and were clearly bent out of shape with jealousy. No good memories were forged in Nagoya. Perhaps the only exception was the sugar biscuits. When we were allowed a little time off training, we purchased packs of biscuits and bottles of cider, which we consumed in a special room in the shop reserved for Navy men. Munching on biscuits and chattering away in our fleeting moment away from the slog was our only reprieve. There were 60 trainees in Nagoya at first. All of us wanted to be fighter pilots, but many were weeded out and dropped from the course. The training duration was shortened to 3 months from the scheduled 4. And I was sent to an airbase in Oita as a fighter trainee. At first, we weren't sure why things were hurried along, but it became abundantly clear later. The war was not going well, and Japan needed 0 pilots in battle theatres ASAP. After our basic training, some of us were sent offshore to places like Singapore. I was bound for Singapore at first, but my orders were changed to Oita. This is where cadets were taught how to fly Model 32-0 fighters. I was dispatched to Oita in January 1944 with about 50 others. Being in a bomber meant you were one of a team of 7, whereas the 0 pilot was captain of his own machine. It was what all of us desired most. Arriving in Oita, I was dismayed to see 3 military spirit bludgeons hanging ominously in the barracks. 3 veterans were sitting in a circle. They stared long and hard at us, wondering whether we would be able to hack it. I knew we were in for a difficult time, but couldn't let the negativity get to me. I boarded the fabled Model 32-0 for the first time. It was markedly different from the red dragonfly I was accustomed to. The rhythmic sound of the engine was powerful and soothing. It handled sublimely, and I felt as if vapour from the engine was engulfing my body. The 0 and I were one. The training 0 came with a back seat for an instructor. We graduated from these before long and flew solo in single-seated models. The Model 32 was very stable. There was one instructor for each trainee team of 4. We mainly practiced taking off and landing to start with, then progressed to standard flight drills and finally aerial dogfight maneuvers against other Zeros. A month passed, and we started to sense a change in mood around base. Instructors would fire us up by screaming that we had no more time to waste in training. It's time to get where the action is. Before long, we were deployed to operational units. Our original 4-month training schedule was concluded in a little over a month. I was transferred to Kasanohara Air Base in Kagoshima Prefecture. Kasanohara Air Base had 3 naval air bases in Kagoshima: Kanoya, Kokubu, and Kasanohara. I moved to Kasanohara in the middle of February 1944. Naval fighter wing squadrons of the 1st Air Fleet were referred to with animal designations: Lion, Tiger, Panther, and Wolf. Those in the 2nd Air Fleet's 221st Naval Air Group 312th Fighter Wings were named after natural phenomena: storm, lightning, and thunder. I was attached to the 312th Wing in the Storm, Arashi Corps, and this is where the real fighter pilot drills began. Trainings at Kasanohara started out as usual. After a week or so, a senior officer told us that things were about to get serious. "Your seniors have been annihilated in the Truk Islands. The stakes are higher now. Get ready for hell, lads." The Navy had been secretive about the defeat in Truk. The Imperial General Headquarters never disclosed discouraging news, but the details trickled down to us by word of mouth anyway. With squadrons in the 1st Air Fleet all but gone, the 2nd Air Fleet was called in to bolster air attacks in the Southwest Pacific. We trained relentlessly from morning to night. Aside from on rainy days, we were usually not allowed to sleep in our quarters. Instead, we kipped under the wings of our aircraft outside. There was no bathing or change of underwear. We became scabby and filthy and constantly beleaguered with itchy skin. Chapter 3. Blooded in Taiwan. The Kamakura period marked the onset of the first samurai government of Japan in 1185. Samurai hegemony lasted throughout the Muromachi and Tokugawa, Edo periods, finally coming to an end in 1868 with the Meiji Restoration. Following the Meiji Restoration, Japan's new imperial government embarked on a path of rapid modernization to catch up with the West. At that time, most Asian and Pacific countries were controlled by Western colonial powers. As Japan started to flex its political muscle on the international stage, it came into conflict with the gigantic Qing dynasty of China and Russia, which was seeking hegemony over China and the Korean peninsula. Japan won the Sino-Japanese War of 1894, and then managed to subdue Russia in the Russo-Japanese War of 1904-05 with a lauded naval victory in which the Russian Baltic Fleet was decimated. This result signified Japan's entry as a force to be reckoned with in international politics and inspired Asian countries who had long suffered under colonial oppression. Japanese leaders at the time had experienced the turbulent days leading up to the Meiji Restoration. They were aware that Japan was out of its depth against Russia in terms of its military power and resources. In order to stop the war as quickly as possible, they engaged early on in diplomatic discussions with Russia, with American President Theodore Roosevelt serving as mediator. The Japanese leaders embodied the ancient proverb by Sun Tzu: "Know your enemy, know thyself, and you shall not fear 100 battles." Nevertheless, Japan's victories made future military leaders arrogant. A couple of decades later, this culminated in Japan's aggressive military, economic, and political machinations in China, resulting in Chinese antipathy toward Japan and growing distrust among former allies such as Great Britain and the United States, who also had stakes in China. In the Great Depression from 1929, powerful nations aimed for the formation of a bloc economy. Japan was undergoing significant population growth but lacked resources. Faced with serious economic and social challenges, Japan opted to advance its interests in Manchuria and other parts of China. Although losing 100,000 men and using a massive proportion of the national budget in the Russo-Japanese War, victory enabled Japan to legitimately secure a foothold in South Manchuria. At the time, Both the Japanese government and her people considered Manchuria to be a lifeline. In addition, many Japanese opinion leaders were of the belief that Japan had an obligation to bring independence and prosperity to Asian countries oppressed under Western colonial rule. As the first modern state in Asia, Japan saw itself as the region's leader and sought to establish a new Asian cooperative scheme to counter traditional colonial powers. Firm in their resolve, Japanese leaders became oblivious to growing anti-Japanese sentiment throughout Asia, and a cruel war ensued that pitted Japan against China and other Asian countries. Chiang Kai-shek aimed for unity in China, and from the early 1920s began advancing through to the north to subjugate military cliques in the region. He reached Beijing in 1928, causing considerable tension with the Japanese army in Manchuria. In 1931, Japan sparked the Manchurian incident in northeast China. The following year, the Japanese army initiated the establishment of Manchukuo, the state of Manchuria, with the last emperor Puyi of the Qing dynasty on the throne. This action was heavily criticized by the League of Nations and led to Japan's withdrawal from the organization. Japan plotted to broaden its interests and influence Beijing and Tianjin in northern China. The main purpose was to cope with the growing influence of communism exerted by the Soviet Union over northeast China and to prepare for war with the Soviet Union in the future. Tension continued to escalate between Japan and the anti-Japanese front, led by Chiang Kai-shek of the Chinese Nationalist Party, as well as Mao Zedong of the Chinese Communist Party. On July 7, 1937, a confrontation between the Japanese and Chinese armies known as the Marco Polo Bridge Incident broke out in the outskirts of Beijing at midnight. At the time, the Japanese cabinet and army were divided into factions supporting either all-out war or peaceful negotiation. The pro-war faction looked down on the Chinese army as lacking vitality and fighting spirit, and assumed that victory could be attained in a relatively short period of time. They took the initiative, which led to further repercussions in Shanghai and Middle China along the Yangtze River. The Shanghai incident broke out in August 1937, and military aggressions started to intensify. In December that year, Japan invaded Nanjing, the capital of China. Chiang Kai-shek retreated to Chongqing in Sichuan province to the west of China, thereby establishing a secure center for all-out resistance backed by the Americans, British, and the Soviet Union. The Second Sino-Japanese War was now in full swing. The Second World War was fought between the Axis powers, Germany, Italy, Japan, and the Allies. It was triggered in September 1939 with Nazi Germany's invasion of Poland, in spite of having had its independence guaranteed by Britain and France. In September 1940, the tripartite pact between Germany, Japan, and Italy was concluded under the Fumimaro-Konoe cabinet. It provoked a strong reaction from the United States and the Allies, who enforced strict economic sanctions against Japan, such as an embargo on oil and iron exports. In the spring of 1941, Prime Minister Konoe maximized efforts to negotiate with the US and avert hostilities. A major reason for conflict between Japan and the US was economic competition in China, especially after the Russo-Japanese War. The US grew ever more distrustful of Japan after the Manchurian incident, and so the crucial issue at the heart of negotiation for the Americans was the withdrawal of the Imperial Japanese Army from China. In the middle of negotiations in July 1941, the Japanese army moved into the southern region of French Indochina, making the situation extremely volatile. Konoe tried urgently to talk directly with President Franklin Roosevelt. According to the dictates of the Meiji Constitution, however, the prerogative of supreme command for both the army and navy was wielded by the emperor and was completely independent of the cabinet or diet. Even the prime minister had no mandate to command the nation's military. Roosevelt and Churchill were already determined to wage war with Japan at that time, and the slow pace of the negotiations under Konoe gave the Americans ample time to prepare for war. Konoe pleaded with Army Minister Hideki Tojo to withdraw the army from China. His pleas were rejected outright, resulting in Konoe dissolving his cabinet in October 1941. Tojo succeeded Konoe as Prime Minister. Tojo did not jump immediately into hostilities with the United States, as Emperor Hirohito still sought a peaceful resolution. In both the Army and Navy, especially in the Navy, there were staunch opponents to waging war against America. It was acknowledged that Japan had neither the military power nor the resources to match the United States in all-out armed conflict. Nevertheless, the line of thought that favored immediate military action in order to acquire territories to bargain with in negotiations came to the fore, lest Japan missed its chance and faced absolute defeat in the future. The catalyst that finally forced Japan's hand was the Hull Note, outline of proposed basis for agreement between the United States and Japan, which was delivered to Japan on November 26, 1941. It demanded that Japan abandon its interests and claims in China, not only those which had been acquired by invasion, but also those rights and interests which were legally procured through negotiation after the Russo-Japanese War. It was essentially an ultimatum that Japan could never agree to, and was thus equivalent to a declaration of war. Commander-in-Chief of the Combined Fleet, Isoroku Yamamoto, was strongly opposed to the Tripartite Pact and any thought of entering a war against America. Now he was obliged to plan and prepare the Navy for an attack on Pearl Harbor on December 8, 1941. The operation resulted in a spectacular victory and solidified America's resolve for war. Many have since observed that Roosevelt and Churchill actually desired that Japan make the first move to force America's hand. In the early stages of the war, Japan achieved some outstanding victories on the Malay Peninsula, Singapore, Philippines, etc. It expanded its control over the West Pacific and even closed in on the north of Australia. It was the Battle of Midway in June 1942, northwest of the Hawaiian archipelago, that proved to be a major turning point in the war. Japan lost many carriers, aircraft, and experienced pilots. In February 1943, Guadalcanal in the Solomon Islands was captured by the US after some furious fighting. In February 1944, Truk Lagoon, Japan's main military base in the South Pacific Theater, was laid to waste by naval air attack, and hundreds of Japanese fighter planes were destroyed. In June to July 1944, Japan's stronghold in Saipan was annihilated in the Battle of Mariana Sea. In October of that year, the Japanese naval fleet was routed in the Battle of Leyte Gulf, which Odachi participated in while stationed in the Philippines. In February to March 1945, the US recaptured the Philippine Islands, which General MacArthur departed with his famous words, "I shall return." Shortly after, Japanese military might was decimated in the Pacific following their defeat at the famous Battle of Iwo Jima. The Japanese mainland was now the target of ferocious air raids. In the spring of 1945, the US began its operation to take Okinawa. The Japanese Army and Navy stationed there were wiped out by June. Meanwhile, the war in China was also going badly for the Japanese. Supported by the United States, the staunch anti-Japanese resistance led by Chiang Kai-shek was a constant thorn in Japan's side. Japan won most of its battles in China initially, and came to occupy major cities throughout the country, but could not make China yield completely. The Americans even commenced with B-24 and B-29 raids against mainland Japan and Taiwan from deep within the Chinese mainland. On July 26, 1945, the Potsdam Declaration demanded Japan's unconditional surrender. Cabinet, Army and Navy leaders debated furiously about the pros and cons of accepting the conditions. On August 6 and 9, atomic bombs were dropped on the cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The Soviet Union took this opportunity to declare war against Japan and rushed in to take over Manchuria and the northern territories formerly occupied by Japan. It was with an official declaration by Emperor Hirohito that Japan surrendered to the Allies. At noon on August 15th, Hirohito made his official announcement to the Japanese people over the radio. This was just as Odachi was about to depart on his final kamikaze mission from Taiwan. Odachi and his comrades fought against Allied forces for around 1 year, a relatively short period. However, it was the time in which the writing was on the wall for the Japanese. As many veteran senior pilots had died, the now hopeless responsibility of protecting the country fell on the shoulders of Odachi and his friends through the most desperate of tactics, kamikaze. Although we didn't know it at the time, the Imperial Japanese Navy First Air Fleet had been routed. The gravity of our losses wasn't immediately clear to us then, but it was precisely at this juncture that I entered the war. I sensed beforehand that I would be dispatched to a base somewhere in the south, either Taiwan or Saipan. In mid-August 1944, we were transferred from Kasanohara to Hsinchu Air Base on the northwest side of Taiwan. New intelligence reported that 11 American carriers were preparing to mount an assault on Taiwan. The IJN's Second Fleet was directed to Taiwan to defend. As our carriers had already been destroyed, naval aircraft were only deployable from ground bases. The 221st Naval Air Group had little more than 60 airmen. We headed to Taiwan separately in 4 or 5 squadrons, of which I was in the second or third group to leave. We carried personal effects in our blue zippered parachute bags. My possessions fitted in, but there was no room left for the parachute. I dropped the bag behind the seat and secured it with a cord to stop it from falling on me in case of some sudden maneuver. A spanner left in the cockpit by mechanics once smacked me fair in the head. I was impressed by the majestic mountains of Yakushima and the beautiful coral reefs of Okinawa as we flew overhead. Taiwan came into view before long. I was happy to arrive, but there was little indication that we were within spitting distance of the combat zone. I was taken aback when I flew into Hsinchu Air Base with its 4 long runways forming a tetragon, and 1 more runway set on an angle. All of them were paved with asphalt or concrete, with the zones between the landing strips covered in lush green grass. It was an impressive base of the likes I had never seen before, designed to facilitate landing from all directions in any wind condition. Moreover, several planes could land simultaneously. As it was our first landing, however, we took our aircraft down with extreme caution. Hopping out of my cockpit, I was once again awestruck by the quality and size of the base. It was so big that I had trouble identifying any of the other crews. All I could see were a few big aircraft parked in the distance. There were several other air bases in Taiwan besides Hsinchu, including Taichung, Tainan, Kaohsiung, Yilan, and Hualien. The oldest were Kaohsiung and Tainan, the latter being particularly spacious, allowing us to land in any grassy zone we liked. The runways in Kaohsiung and Tainan were paved, but Hsinchu was the best. Our orders were to intercept B-24 bomber raids, fly patrol, and provide air cover for an army convoy sailing to Xiamen. When not out on sorties, we continued training. Our first taste of action, however, didn't happen until the middle of October. New improved fighters like the Grumman F-6F Hellcat were making life difficult for Japanese airmen. Faced with such formidable opposition, fewer of our planes were making it back, and our fleets were frequently rearranged to compensate for losses. The airplanes of the First Air Fleet were originally tasked with patrolling the Southwest Pacific. We were supposed to provide backup when necessary, but with the first having been routed in the Battle of Mariana, there were hardly any operational fighters left in the area. It seemed inevitable that we'd be in the thick of it a lot sooner than we had envisaged. For the first few months, however, all we did was train in the same format as Kasanohara, except for tactical training, which involved 8 versus 8 zeros instead of 4 versus 4. It was as close to real combat as possible, so there was no room for mistakes. If information came in that Americans were approaching the east coast of Taiwan, we would fly to Hualien Air Base. If there was intelligence of the enemy somewhere in the south, we would fly to Tainan or Kaohsiung. All the air bases in Taiwan became home as we pogoed around the island. Although we were still officially in training, there was always a high degree of tension. We were never that far from the action and were ready to scramble without delay. We heard about losses being sustained here and there, and flight drills were conducted with the understanding that it would become the real thing at a moment's notice. We were ready. Our senses had been honed, and some of our men had already seen combat. even boasting of shots that had found their mark. We were all brimming with confidence at the beginning. The completion of a training mission was signalled by the lead plane rocking its wings. One of our planes once veered away to fly under a suspended bridge in a river valley. I mischievously followed suit, and so did the rest of the fighters in our section. Another time we flew close to the river surface, causing fishing boats to capsize. We were all aged only 17 to 19 after all, just teenage lads wanting to have a bit of fun. Rowdy behaviour took the edge off our volatile situation. Taiwan was a bountiful place, and there was always a big basket full of bananas and citrus fruits located at the front of the barracks. Our 3 daily meals were excellent, just as they were in Kasanohara. The mess staff cooked our meals and took care of menial tasks such as washing the dishes. We often slept outside on the grass, protected by a smouldering pyrethrum coil, which kept the mosquitoes in check. In August and September, the soft breeze at night made it more comfortable than sleeping inside the stifling barracks. With training concluded, my debut sortie was to the Xiamen Channel between mainland China and Taiwan. We were to escort supply ships in what was going to be our first real opportunity to test the fruits of our hard training. We were fired up and determined to deal to any enemy planes unlucky enough to cross us. We didn't know why the fleet was headed to Xiamen, but assumed that the army was preparing to transfer military units from northeast Manchuria to the south. The fleet headed from the Yellow Sea, located between mainland China and the Korean peninsula, to the north of Taiwan. The Yellow Sea was relatively stable at the time, but the area surrounding Taiwan was becoming increasingly perilous. Japan had already defeated the Chinese Nationalist Air Force by this stage, so the odds of being intercepted by Chinese fighters were low. Moreover, no US or British fighters had been spotted west of the line between Okinawa and Taiwan. Still, we didn't want to take the Chinese factor for granted. Should they appear, we had no idea what they would be flying. It could be American or Soviet Union-built aircraft, and we had no clue whatsoever about the latter. This element of the unknown kept us edgy and vigilant. The weather was fine, and visibility was good. We could see scores of ships in convoy heading to the East China Sea via the Taiwan Strait. We flew over them in 2 formations comprised of 8 zeros each. We circled at around 5,000 meters altitude as the ships cut through the blue sea below. Each escort mission lasted about 2 hours. When one team finished, they would rock their wings for the other to take over. Once I took my aircraft down to about 200 meters to make a pass over some of the ships. The sailors on deck waved up at me. I felt a strong responsibility to keep them from harm's way. As it turns out, we didn't encounter any enemy planes on our debut mission. Taiwan remained calm for a while after we arrived, but we kept an eye on what was happening in the east. The first enemy airplane that we saw, however, flew in from the west. It was a giant B-24 Liberator. I heard later that they raided Taiwan a few times before we arrived there. The B-24S flew at approximately 6,000 or 7,000 meters as they dropped their payloads on our facilities and then headed westward to their bases. We assumed that they came from Chongqing, deep in the west of China. They were certainly capable of travelling great distances. When news came through from our army stationed in China that 4 B-24AS were en route to Taiwan, we scrambled to intercept. I chased one B-24 at high altitude on its return journey. No matter how much I accelerated, I could not close the distance. A little more, a little more. I kept the pursuit going until noticing that I had almost flown as far as mainland China. I had to give up the pursuit as my fuel was running out. The B-24S were much bigger than we imagined. We knew that they had 4 propellers and a wingspan of 34 meters, but they took our breath away when we saw them for real. The airframe was sturdy and covered in duralumin plate. They were completely different to the Mitsubishi G4M Type 1 attack bomber, Allied reporting name Betty, which was the biggest plane in the Imperial Japanese Navy. Our planes were smaller and painted a drab grey colour. We almost felt cheated. Another time I intercepted a B-24 and fired into its fuselage. I was sure that my bullets hit home, but to my utter surprise, the bomber flew away as if nothing happened. I learned later that B-24s were protected by thick resin armor around the fuel tanks. We were advised that shooting at B-24s was virtually futile. Even so, whenever we had drinks in the barracks, we discussed how to shoot down these giants. Somebody observed, "Their machine gun turrets spin around like this, so it's useless hitting them from this direction. The best way must be to shoot underneath from the rear of the fuselage." Another pilot mentioned, "Wait for it from a higher position in front, fire at it as you dive, and then fly under the fuselage to attack on the turnaround." These strategies were easier said than done. I was never able to get myself in a position to try them out. The B-29 bombers were bigger than the B-24s and superior in performance. These beasts also ventured into our skies on occasion, but wouldn't hang around long. I assumed that they were on recon missions taking aerial photos of Taiwan before returning to base in China. They flew higher and faster than B-24s. We tried to intercept them, but it took too long for Zeros to reach 8,000 or 9,000 meters. At 6,000 meters, I would have to put on an oxygen mask while climbing at full throttle, but the propeller would spin meaninglessly at this altitude because the air was too thin. The speedometer needle fluttered near the bottom of the dial, and we'd burn through the fuel. The B-29s soon disappeared above us, so we had no chance to engage them. We never heard of any B-24s or B-29s being shot down around Taiwan. We were uneasy that Japan's leaders were not developing better planes to match these airborne fortresses. It was all we could do to take off and save our planes when they came to bomb our bases. We attempted to engage if they came within a feasible range, but they mostly flew high in the sky, leaving us as helpless spectators while they wreaked havoc on our airfields. The Zero was designed by Mitsubishi Heavy Industry and Nakajima Aircraft Company as a carrier-based fighter for the Navy. It debuted in 1940. According to the imperial calendar in use in Japan at the time, this was the 2600th year of the founding of Japan, so the Zero was named after the last numeral of this year. The Zero proved itself to be a highly capable fighter plane in the air battles over China, and it featured prominently in the Pacific from December 1941. Greatly respected by the enemy, it remained Japan's most famous fighter to the end of the war. Over 10,400 were produced with 10 modified variants. By the end of the war, it was altered again to carry bombs in kamikaze suicide missions. The first mass-produced Zero was the Model 21. Its maximum speed was 533 km per h and had a cruising distance of up to 2,530 km. It was powered by a 1,000 horsepower engine and was armed with two 7.7 mm and 220 mm machine guns. Compared with fighters of other countries, the Zero's cruising distance was relatively good. It had excellent turning ability and daunting attacking capacity. These capabilities were enabled by a total weight of only 2.4 tons, almost 1 ton lighter than the Grumman F-4F Wildcat. It was half the weight of the later Grumman F-6F Hellcat. Its lightweight, however, was only possible through compromises. Its defensive ability and the strength of the airframe were sacrificed, making the Zero prone to catching fire when hit. There was no plating to protect the pilot, and if it dived at a velocity of 63,040 km per h, there was a very real danger of the plane disintegrating in mid-air. Japan failed to develop a viable successor to the Zero, relying on minor tweaks here and there to bolster firepower. This led to gradual increases in weight, which in turn decreased its turning ability. By contrast, US fighter capabilities improved significantly with the development of aircraft like the Hellcat. Air tactics began to change as the battle in the Pacific intensified. Before my time, it was common for 3 fighters to make 1 unit. Japanese pilots would fly in formation until the enemy came into view, then would break off to assail targets individually in dogfights. The early Zero pilots were very adept at this mode of attack and used a special twisting-in maneuver like a corkscrew loop called hinerikomi. When chased by the enemy, the standard Zero tactic was to climb suddenly at maximum speed, then turn over at the highest point to steal the advantage. I heard of one situation where a Zero was chasing an American fighter, with another fighter chasing that Zero, and yet another Zero chasing that fighter, all in a chain. This scenario suited Japanese pilot tactics. There was always banter of who shot down how many planes, and we would celebrate the feats of shoot-down kings, aces. The situation started to worsen for us from around the Battle of New Britain, Rabaul, in 1943, especially with the introduction of the new Grumman F-6F Hellcats. They had double the horsepower of the F-4Fs and were a superior machine to our Zeros. They hunted in packs of 4 and avoided individual dogfights, focusing instead on team battles. US pilots researched our strategies thoroughly and formulated maneuvers to take advantage of our weaknesses. For example, our famous sharp-turning Hineri-Komi defensive ploy had one major drawback in that the Zero's speed would drop significantly for a few seconds at the point of turnover. One of the 4 American fighters waiting at altitude targeted this instant and unleashed a spray of lead just as the Zero was about to plunge into the dive. If the Zero was caught in this trap, there was no way to escape. The Japanese pilots had to adapt to keep ahead of the game, so adopted a similar 4-fighter team and style of combat. These changes were already being implemented by the time I started my training. We were advised against individual combat and told instead to take the initiative, making concentrated bursts in first contact. This meant that good teamwork was vital. The most effective method was to fly at altitude to spot enemy aircraft in advance, then make a rapid dive toward them and shoot at the crossing point. The difference between winning and losing came down to which side detected the enemy first. When shooting, I would press the center stick trigger with my right thumb for a few seconds. Any longer, and the bullets would run out too quickly. It was often impossible to tell whose bullets hit the target, but there were occasions when I knew I had hit the mark. Still, the Hellcat never let on that it was hit, as its airframe had been redesigned to mitigate the impact of enemy fire. The only way to shoot one down for sure was to make a direct hit on the pilot in the cockpit. Rainy days were spent in the classroom. We sat cross-legged and listened to lectures outlining the latest American tactics and discussions led by vets who had survived close run-ins with the improved Hellcats. To hone maneuvers in our 4-fighter teams, for example, we were told where the first and second aircraft needed to fly. When the first turns away, the third must follow behind in cover. Then, the second and the fourth, which were here, must fly in behind the third. This was all life-saving advice, but inevitably required incredible discipline and nerve under extreme pressure to execute. Some officers were still under the false impression that Zeros were superior to Hellcats. One of them asked an instructor, "Why can't we engage in dogfights to take advantage of the Zero's agility?" The instructor told him plainly, "That's impossible. It's all just empty theory now. Go ahead if you insist, but you'll be the first one to buy it." Instead, we were repeatedly told, "When you face the enemy, fly straight at him like a game of chicken. Never turn away earlier than the enemy. Go in with the intention of letting your propellers bite into his plane. This is the only way they will show their bellies, and that's when you shoot. They don't have strong hearts like you boys. Go for their guts." It was often commented that if 2 fighters with the same capability and skill engaged in combat, the victor would be the one who takes the higher position. If we found ourselves at lower altitude and needed to take evasive action, the first thing we were taught to do was accelerate into a dive. As the enemy followed, the next move was to press hard on the left pedal while pulling the center stick strongly to the right. This would make the Zero slide forward to the diagonal left. I could also do it the opposite way. The irregular sliding movement generated air turbulence around the Zero and in turn affected the trajectory of the enemy's rounds. To successfully perform the sliding maneuver took considerable strength in the arms and legs, and it also induced a lot of torque on the airframe. I could hear my plane creak and was always afraid that it might fall to bits on me. I had a habit of removing my gloves before any action to stop my hand from slipping off the controls. I also took off my headgear and placed it on my lap because it hindered neck movement and I couldn't look around me. The most dangerous area was to the rear. I liked to assess if there was anything coming from behind. Rear below was particularly treacherous, as it was a blind spot from the cockpit. Even when I was in pursuit of an enemy aircraft, I would check right, left, below and behind to make sure I wasn't in somebody else's sights. A surprise attack when engaging an enemy in front would not end well. We were told to watch the front 80% of the time, and the back 20%. I could tell when the altitude was 4,000 or 5,000 meters, without referring to the altimeter, just by the feel to the plane. This is higher than the mightiest peak in Japan, Mount Fuji at 3,776 meters. We were advised to attach our oxygen masks over 4,000 meters, but few of us did. The mask had a long tube necklace which restricted head movement, so we usually held on until 6,000 meters. The air being so thin that high, it was hard to get enough oxygen without it. To compensate, I used to take 2 deep inhalations followed by 1 exhalation. Earplugs were inserted on a rapid climb to protect the ears. I followed this protocol at first, but gradually became accustomed to the pressure. High altitude also resulted in pain shooting through my mouth and teeth through sucking in the cold air. There was no heater, but we kept warm enough thanks to the heat of the engine and the exhaust fumes that infiltrated the cockpit. Each airbase had a 15-meter pole located in the midpoint of the runway with a streamer attached to the top to indicate the direction and strength of the wind. This was vital for making a clean landing. If the streamer was horizontal, we knew that the wind was blowing hard at about 12 to 13 meters per second. When we made unscheduled landings in different bases, streamers were often absent, forcing us to wait until somebody ran out to the runway to attach one. At bases with grass runways, we identified suitable places to land by the flatness of the vegetation. If it was still long, that meant it was dangerous to land on because it hadn't been used for landing before. Fuel permitting, we'd do another pass over the base if we weren't certain. Paved runways with a headwind made for the best landing conditions. The Zero could make a 3-point landing and come to a stop in about 150 to 200 meters. That distance increased with a tailwind. A side wind was a little tricky to cope with. The airframe caught the wind and tilted the aircraft so that one wheel touched the ground first, meaning too much weight on one point. There were many incidents where planes were pushed to the side this way, resulting in the wheels breaking up. I mitigated this danger by slowing down as I came into land and moving the rudder the moment of touching down. If the side wind was coming from the left, I would press down on the left pedal to guide the airframe to the front, left, essentially straightening up in the wind. This was a subtle operation requiring careful consideration of how much we could be blown off course and landing slightly upwind and to the side of the runway's centerline. Landing was much more difficult than taking off. There was a rule for landing called the mid-air pass. When we approached the runway, we flew 200 meters overhead and passed by first. Banking our wings, the officer in charge looking through his binoculars confirmed by saying, "Number such and such passed." Only then could we start the landing procedure. Everyone on the ground watched as we came in. Even if they didn't know the pilot, they could assess his skill level by how well he landed. After a successful landing, the engine would be revved for a few seconds before alighting the aircraft and running to the command post to report in. Aircraft landed separately at smaller bases. Runways were typically 50 to 60 meters wide, but planes were prone to swinging to the sides, so as much leeway as possible was appreciated. At large bases, 4 planes could land in unison. We could even do 8 simultaneously at the largest. It just depended on the conditions. We relied on hand signals and non-verbal cues to coordinate our approach. The runways on carrier decks, however, were considerably narrower and always a harrowing prospect. We had lunch in the cockpit on long flights. This was usually a couple of rice balls wrapped in bamboo leaves made by the mess staff. We stuffed the rice balls in the pockets of our flying suits and looked forward to scoffing them in the cockpit. We never took water bottles for some reason. I don't know why, but I guess it was because we never really got thirsty. No matter how loudly nature called, we refrained from taking a dump or a whiz in the cockpit. Having said that, if our bladders were bursting and peeing was unavoidable, one small consolation was that it dried quickly through the engine heat. Some pilots tucked into their lunches as soon as they leveled out after takeoff. They would move to the front of the formation and let the others know, even though enemy aircraft could appear at any moment. Boys being boys, sometimes pilots would sneak up behind those enjoying their lunches and frighten the living daylights out of them. Fighter pilots were a special breed in the Navy. Each one was, in a sense, a lone wolf. Flight hours were more significant than official rank, and pilots who had done the hours and proved themselves in battle were treated with respect, even if their rank was low. They were allowed in the cadre's chamber called the gun room, which was off-limits even to commissioned officers without enough flight hours. Under the commander was the assistant commander, flight commander, squadron leaders, section and assistant section leaders. The commander was usually a colonel or lieutenant colonel. Under him were 60 to 70 pilots. Promotions came rapidly. I started at the lowest rank of Flight Petty Officer Second Class, but was promoted to Flight Petty Officer First Class within 3 months, and Superior Flight Petty Officer 3 months later. Then Chief Flyer to Flyer Second Class, and Flyer First Class on August 15, 1945. I can't remember when I was made Flyer Second Class. In those days, most big towns in Taiwan had sugar companies run by Japanese. The factories had clubhouses where wives of employees took good care of us. On the second floor of one such clubhouse, there were 5 or 6 Japanese tatami mat rooms in which we could rest. On the ground floor was a large hall, cafeteria, and a room for listening to music and playing Japanese chess. The facilities were built for company personnel and their families, but we were permitted to come and go as we pleased. These were still relatively carefree days, as we didn't know the misery that awaited us. When stationed at the Hsinchu base, we occasionally visited the local town to unwind after long training periods, or after completing 2 to 3 weeks of sorties. Somehow this information always got out, and we were greeted by throngs of Japanese girls living in Taiwan. It was quite perplexing when they called us by name. We had no idea who they were. We were invited to their homes for dinner and ended up going to several houses each night. It was decided who would go where first by scissors paper stone. The families welcomed us with delicious food cooked by the mothers. Alcohol flowed freely. We went from one home to the next after an hour, indulging in 3 full meals in a single night. One girl gave me a scarf on my 2nd or 3rd visit. It was made of cloth from a used parachute and was embroidered with pink cherry blossoms and a navy blue anchor, the symbol of Yokaran. Brushed onto the silk was a poem composed by a pilot who died at Pearl Harbor. The characters were so exquisite, I figured her father must have written it. She gave me another scarf with 221st Naval Air Group Storm Corps, 1 shot, 1 kill, and my name stitched on it. I wore it on all my sorties. The others liked to give me a hard time about it. "Hey, fashion queen," they would chide. "Piss off," I replied. I wore this religiously when I sortied. I intended for it to be wrapped around my neck in my final mission as a kamikaze pilot. I never saw her again. If letters were not censored the way they were, I might have kept in contact. I will always remember her name, though. My wife kept the scarf in a drawer after the war. The colour of the stitching was vivid pink, but it faded over the years. I told my wife that I received it from a young girl in Taiwan, whose family I became friendly with. She understood its immense value and treated it with the utmost respect.